The first scream did not come from a person. It came from a weathered cabin door slamming against frozen wood somewhere high above the valley, where no one was supposed to be living anymore. Down below, the people of Cold Spur stopped what they were doing and looked toward the forgotten ridge. Someone whispered that the old abandoned homestead had finally fallen apart. Someone else crossed himself. Only one old trapper narrowed his eyes at the thin ribbon of smoke rising into the pale winter sky. He quietly said, "No, somebody's alive up there." If you've ever wondered how a person can lose everything in a single day and still find the strength to build something no one can take away, stay with this story. Because before that first winter ended, the woman everyone pitied would become the one the whole valley depended on. The snow began before sunrise on the morning Ezra Holt was buried. It drifted down so gently that the church bell sounded louder than the wind itself. Every rooftop in Cold Spur slowly turned white. Every wagon track disappeared beneath fresh powder. Every footprint looked as though it had been placed on untouched paper. Behind the pine coffin stood 24-year-old Clara Holt. She folded her arms tightly against the cold, not because she was shivering, because if she let them fall, they might begin reaching for someone who would never answer again. Her eyes rested on the snow around her boots, one footprint after another, each one leading toward a future she could not yet imagine. Ezra had crossed the river 2 mornings earlier with the season's last wagon load of wool. The river returned only his hat. It floated in slow circles beside a broken willow branch, while the current carried everything else away. By the time the search party reached home, the truth had already arrived before them. His horse never returned. His wagon splintered against driftwood. The river kept moving south as though nothing had happened. Clara had already cried through the first endless night. She cried again when she found Ezra's gloves hanging beside the kitchen door. She cried when she saw the unfinished loaf cooling on the table where he had promised they would eat together after sunset. Now, there were no tears left, only long breaths that caught halfway inside her chest, only empty silence where ordinary days used to live. The preacher finished speaking. People removed their hats. The coffin disappeared beneath frozen earth. One handful of soil after another struck the lid below. Each soft thud sounded heavier than the last. When the service ended, neighbors surrounded Ezra's mother instead of his widow. They offered quiet words. They shook hands. They promised prayers. No one asked Clara where she would sleep that night. No one asked whether she had enough wood for winter. Everyone already knew whose house she lived in. Everyone also knew who ruled inside it. Margaret Holt stood near the church gate without lowering her head once. She accepted every sympathy with calm eyes and straight shoulders. Anyone watching would have believed she was already counting tomorrow's chores instead of today's loss. For 3 years, Clara had worked beneath that woman's roof. She rose before daylight. She carried water through snow. She fed chickens before breakfast. She wove cloth until her fingertips cracked open during winter. Every blanket, every shirt, every bolt of cloth that left the farm had passed through Clara's hands. Yet not one coin had ever been placed into her own pocket. Whenever buyers praised her careful work, Margaret answered the compliments herself. Whenever money changed hands, it disappeared into Margaret's apron. Clara had learned long ago that asking questions inside that house only made the rooms colder. Ezra had tried more than once to soften the distance between the two women, but every attempt ended the same way. A quiet meal, a silent evening, another tomorrow exactly like yesterday. Only once had Ezra spoken. Honestly. The night before he crossed the river, he sat beside the stove without removing his boots. His hands rested on his knees. He stared into the fire longer than usual. "My mother wants every bundle sold before prices fall," he finally said. "The river's running high." Clara looked toward the frosted window. "Then wait another day." Ezra rubbed his palms together. "I've already argued." Those were the last full words they ever shared. Standing beside his grave now, Clara remembered the tightness around his mouth that evening. It looked different in memory. Not worry, not anger. More like someone carrying a burden too heavy to hand to another person. The townspeople slowly disappeared down the snowy road. Church doors closed. Horse hooves faded into the distance. Soon, only fresh graves remained beneath the falling snow. Clara turned toward home alone. The farmhouse looked exactly as it always had. Smoke drifted from the chimney. The lantern glowed beside the porch. Nothing about the place admitted that its only son now rested beneath frozen ground. Inside, supper waited untouched. No one invited Clara to the table. Margaret ate quietly beneath the yellow lamp. Knives scraped against plates. The clock ticked. Outside, wind pushed snow against the windows. After the dishes were cleared away, Margaret folded a towel with slow, careful hands. She finally looked toward Clara. "We need to settle what comes next." The room suddenly felt much smaller. Clara remained standing. Margaret spoke without raising her voice. "This house belongs to the Holt family." She paused only long enough to smooth another wrinkle from the towel. "My nephew Samuel arrives before month's end. He'll manage the farm now." Clara waited. Every word seemed to arrive colder than the last. "You'll need to leave before he comes." The fire continued burning inside the stove, but somehow the room no longer held any warmth. Clara looked around the kitchen she had cleaned thousands of times. The shelves she had stocked. The floor she had scrubbed. The bread she had baked. Not one piece of it had ever truly belonged to her. She lifted her eyes toward Margaret. "I helped build this place." Margaret folded the towel one final time. "You lived here." "There is a difference." Clara stood perfectly still. Then she quietly answered, "I'll be gone." She turned toward her small room without another word. Behind her, the kitchen clock continued counting the seconds until everything she had called home would belong to someone else. The room stayed silent long after Margaret walked away. Only the old clock kept moving. Its steady ticking filled every corner of the little bedroom, where Clara had spent the last 3 years, believing she belonged. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed without removing her coat. The walls looked different now. The tiny window, the worn blanket, the small wooden chest at the foot of the bed. None of them felt familiar anymore. They felt borrowed. Outside, the wind brushed snow against the glass. Inside, Clara slowly opened the old cedar chest she had carried from her father's farm on the day she married Ezra. It had remained closed almost the entire marriage. Now it held everything the world had failed to take from her. 2 wool dresses, a patched winter shawl, a kitchen knife with a smooth bone handle, a bar of homemade soap wrapped in cloth, a tiny cloth pouch hidden beneath folded stockings. She untied the string. A handful of silver coins rested inside. Not many, just enough to buy flour, maybe a few nails, perhaps a small sack of seed if spring ever arrived. She had saved them 1 coin at a time, selling extra eggs at market, mending neighbors' clothes quietly, doing little jobs nobody else noticed. She had never told Ezra, not because she doubted him, because she had learned that a woman without something of her own could disappear overnight. Tonight proved she had been right. She closed her fingers around the coins, They felt warmer than the room. For the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself one slow breath that reached all the way into her lungs. Not because life had become easier, because she finally knew she still possessed one thing nobody could order her to leave behind: her own hands. Before dawn, Clara packed quietly. She folded every piece of clothing with care, wrapped the knife in a towel, placed the little pouch of coins beneath everything else. At the very bottom rested a paper packet her mother had given her years before. Wild lavender seeds. Her mother had smiled while placing them into her hand. Plant these wherever life begins again. At the time, Clara thought they were talking about flowers. Now those words returned with unexpected weight. She slipped the seeds carefully into her pocket. The sky remained dark when she carried the small chest toward the front door. She stopped beside the kitchen table. A sheet of rough paper lay near the stove. She picked up a piece of charcoal, then wrote only one sentence. "Everything I leave behind has already been paid for with my work." She left the note beside the cold bread knife, without signing her name. Then she opened the door. The cold struck her face immediately. Fresh snow covered every fence rail, every rooftop, every path through town. Cold Spur still slept beneath winter. She stepped through the gate without looking back. The road felt endless. The first house belonged to Mrs. Martha Ellis, an older widow who had once traded apples with Clara during harvest. Martha answered the door, wearing a heavy quilt around her shoulders. The moment she saw the small chest, she understood. Without asking questions, she led Clara inside. A bowl of hot broth appeared beside the stove. Steam rose into the chilly kitchen. Clara wrapped both hands around the bowl. The warmth reached her fingers before anything else. Martha watched the fire quietly, then lowered her voice. "I wish you could stay." She looked toward the window. "But your mother-in-law has long arms in this town." Clara nodded. She already knew. Kindness often lived inside people. Courage was harder to find. She thanked Martha for the meal, then stepped back into the snow. The second house belonged to a family already struggling through winter. 5 children crowded around one stove. The mother opened the door only halfway. She looked at Clara's chest, then looked back toward the hungry faces inside. "I'm sorry." There was no need for another explanation. Clara smiled gently. "I understand." The woman hurried inside. Moments later, she returned carrying a fresh loaf wrapped in cloth. "It's all I can spare." Clara accepted it with both hands. Some gifts carried more weight than money ever could. At the third house, no one answered. She heard movement behind the curtains. Someone stood only a few feet away, waiting, listening, choosing silence. Clara remained there for several seconds, then quietly turned away. Before she reached the road, the door opened only a crack. A small piece of cheese rested on the porch. The door closed again before she could thank whoever had placed it there. She picked it up carefully. Not everyone could stand beside her. Some still found small ways to help. By sunrise, she reached the northern fork outside Cold Spur. One road dropped toward neighboring settlements. The other climbed into lonely country where abandoned homesteads slowly disappeared beneath wind and snow. Her father used to speak about that place. Forgotten land, land people claimed was too rocky, too cold, too lonely. No family had lived there for years. Most folks believed nothing could survive on that ridge. Clara stared toward the distant hills. If nobody wanted that land, nobody could throw her off it. The thought settled inside her like a small fire refusing to go out. She tightened the rope around her wooden chest, then began climbing. The trail punished every step. Snow hid loose stones. Ice waited beneath thin powder. Twice she slipped. Once the chest slid backward, pulling her toward a steep drop. Her hands caught a frozen tree root just before she lost everything. The rough bark tore her gloves. Her knees struck hidden rock. She stayed there, breathing hard against the frozen ground. For one long moment, she closed her eyes. The mountain made no promises. No one would come looking for her. No church bell would ring. No neighbor would hear her call. The wind moved quietly through pine trees above. Clara slowly pushed herself upright. She wiped blood from her knuckles onto her coat, then looked back toward the valley. Cold Spur had become only a handful of tiny rooftops beneath drifting snow. Margaret Holt was somewhere down there, warm, comfortable, certain the young widow would soon disappear from everyone's memory. Clara adjusted the rope across her shoulders. No. The single word escaped into the cold air, not loud, not angry, just certain. She turned uphill once more. Each step carried her farther from everything she had lost, and closer to a place nobody else believed was worth keeping. By late afternoon, the broken outline of an old cabin finally appeared through the falling snow. Its roof had partly collapsed. The front door hung crooked on one hinge. The fence had disappeared beneath weeds and drifted ice. Even from a distance, it looked abandoned by the world itself. Clara stopped at the edge of the clearing. She looked at the broken cabin, then at the wide stretch of forgotten land surrounding it. No voices, no orders, no locked doors. Only silence. For the first time since Ezra's funeral, the silence belonged to her. The first night tested every promise Clara had made to herself. Wind slipped through the broken walls. Snow drifted across the floor. Each breath rose in pale clouds before her face. The cabin had been empty for years. Nature had slowly taken it back. Birds had built nests inside the chimney. The roof opened to the gray evening sky. The fireplace held nothing except cold ash and broken stones. Most people would have turned around. Most people would have walked back toward town before darkness settled over the mountain. Clara did neither. She placed her small wooden chest against the doorway to block part of the wind. Then she gathered broken boards from the collapsed porch. Dry branches lay beneath the thick pine trees where the snow had not reached them. By sunset, smoke rose from the old chimney once again. Thin, weak, but alive. She sat beside the little fire, warming stiff hands. The cabin still looked broken, but it no longer looked abandoned. Morning arrived wrapped in bright winter sunlight. The mountain seemed completely different. The valley below disappeared beneath white clouds. Pine forests stretched across the hills like endless waves. The silence felt enormous. No wagon wheels, no church bell, no voices giving orders, only ravens calling across the frozen ridge. Clara stepped outside carrying her father's old pocket knife. She slowly walked around the property. The fence had almost vanished beneath weeds. The barn leaned badly toward one side. The well still stood. Its wooden cover had cracked, but the stone walls remained solid. Beyond the cabin, she found something unexpected. A small garden surrounded by low field stones. Everything inside slept beneath frozen earth. Yet the soil looked rich. Someone had once cared deeply for this place. Someone had planted with hope. Clara knelt and brushed snow away with her glove. Dark soil appeared beneath the ice. She smiled without realizing it. Winter covered many things. It did not erase them. The next days became a steady rhythm of work. Every sunrise began before the cold loosened its grip. She patched holes in the walls, using old timber from the fallen shed. She tied fresh rope across the hanging door. She cleared snow away from the well. She stacked firewood higher every evening. Her hands blistered. The blisters hardened. Her shoulders ached. The ache slowly became strength. Each small job changed the cabin. Each completed task reminded her that the mountain answered effort instead of family names. One afternoon, she discovered several wild apple trees growing behind the barn. Their branches twisted beneath snow. A few frozen apples still clung stubbornly to the limbs. Most people would have ignored them. Clara gathered every one. Nothing on this mountain could be wasted. Not food, not time, not hope. Several days later, while carrying water from the well, she noticed fresh footprints crossing the snow. Not deer, not wolves. Human. They led toward the cabin. Clara quietly set down the bucket, her hand wrapped around the handle of the small kitchen knife. The footsteps stopped outside the fence. An elderly woman stood there with 3 goats grazing behind her. She looked nearly 70. Her heavy coat had been patched many times. The mountain wind pushed loose gray hair across her face. She studied Clara for a long moment before speaking. "I've watched smoke rising from this place for nearly 2 weeks." Clara remained still. The woman nodded toward the cabin. "I figured either someone had moved in," she glanced toward the roof, "or the mountain had learned to build fires." For the first time in many days, Clara almost laughed. The old woman noticed. "Good. That means winter hasn't frozen you solid." She stepped closer. "My name is Ruth Harper. I live over the next ridge." Clara introduced herself. Ruth looked around the property with experienced eyes. Her gaze settled on the roof. "That beam won't survive another heavy storm." Clara followed her eyes. "I know. The chimney also needs cleaning." "I know. The well bucket rope is nearly rotten." "I noticed yesterday." Ruth nodded slowly. "You've been paying attention." Without another word, she untied a bundle from one of her goats. Inside rested heavy canvas, strong rope, a small sack of nails. Clara looked surprised. "I can't pay for these." "They aren't free," Ruth answered calmly. "You'll repay me when you're able." Then she pointed toward the roof. "Today, we work." For hours they climbed across frozen beams. They replaced broken supports. They stretched canvas over the weakest section before securing it with fresh rope. By sunset, the roof no longer shifted beneath the wind. Neither woman wasted words. When something needed carrying, they carried it. When something needed fixing, they fixed it. As darkness settled, Ruth accepted a bowl of vegetable soup beside the fire. She looked around the cabin. "You've done more in 2 weeks than others managed in 20 years." Clara stirred the soup quietly. "I don't have anywhere else." Ruth shook her head. "That's not why." She pointed toward the repaired doorway. "Some people only see what a place used to be. You saw what it could become." The words stayed with Clara long after Ruth disappeared into the snowy hills. Winter deepened. Snow climbed higher against the fences. Ice covered the creek. The mountain grew harsher every week. But something else quietly grew beside it. The abandoned cabin slowly became a home. The broken garden became neat rows waiting for spring. The barn stood straighter after new support beams. Fresh smoke greeted every sunrise. One afternoon, Ruth arrived carrying several small cloth bundles. She opened them across the kitchen table. Lavender, wild thyme, mountain sage, rosemary. They grow well on these hills. Clara breathed in the fresh scent. "They smell wonderful." Ruth smiled faintly. "Most folks in Cold Spur think nothing useful grows up here." She gently placed a handful into Clara's palm. "That's because they've never bothered to climb." Those words settled deep inside Clara. She suddenly remembered the little paper packet resting inside her wooden chest. Her mother's lavender seeds. She hurried to retrieve them. Ruth studied the tiny packet carefully. "Those are old. They belong to my mother. then plant them. When spring comes, they've already waited long enough. That evening, Clara sat beside the fire holding the small packet. She imagined purple flowers dancing across the forgotten hillside. Not because anyone else would see them, because they would prove something. Life could return to places everyone had abandoned. Before we move on, think about this for a moment. Sometimes survival begins the day a person stops asking for a place in someone else's world and starts building one with their own hands. Outside, the wind howled across the mountain. Inside, the little cabin stood firm against it. Neither Clara nor the valley below knew it yet. But before winter ended, the very people who had watched her leave without lifting a hand would soon be climbing this same lonely trail, hoping the young widow would open her door. The storm arrived 3 nights later, not with thunder, not with warning. The wind simply changed. Ruth stepped outside her cabin before sunrise, watched the clouds racing over the western ridge, and immediately started climbing toward Clara's farm. She reached the gate, breathing hard. "Close every shutter. Bring the goats into the barn. Fill every bucket." Clara did not ask why. She simply moved. By noon, the mountain had disappeared. Snow flew sideways across the ridge. The sky became white from earth to clouds. The trail leading toward Cold Spur vanished beneath drifting snow. Even the fence posts disappeared one by one. The storm did not pass that night. It stayed. Hour after hour, the wind struck the cabin until the walls trembled. The repaired roof groaned. The chimney shook. Clara fed wood into the fire without stopping. Every few hours she stepped outside with a shovel, clearing snow away from the front door before it buried the entrance completely. Each trip lasted only moments. Even those few moments left ice clinging to her eyelashes. Morning finally arrived. The wind weakened. The mountain stood silent again. Nothing moved. Everything had changed. The trail down toward Cold Spur no longer existed. Only smooth white hills stretched across the valley. Ruth studied the distant slopes. They'll be trapped. Clara understood immediately. The town's supply wagons always came from the southern road. If the pass had closed, food would stop arriving. 3 days passed. No smoke appeared from the valley road. No wagons climbed the mountain. Then, on the 4th afternoon, Clara noticed movement far below. 3 small figures struggled through waist-deep snow. They stopped often, fell, rose again. By sunset, they reached the cabin. The oldest man collapsed beside the fence before speaking. "We need help." Clara recognized him. It was Samuel Carter, the mayor of Cold Spur. His beard carried frozen ice. His gloves were torn open. Behind him stood the town doctor and the church pastor. All 3 looked exhausted. Samuel removed his hat. "The southern road is gone. The avalanche buried everything. The flour mills can't reach us. Our stores are nearly empty." His voice grew quieter. "People are already skipping meals." Clara remained silent. The mountain wind moved softly through the pines behind her. Samuel finally lifted his eyes. "We heard you've been baking." Ruth watched without speaking. This was no longer her conversation. The mayor continued. "We came to ask if you'd sell bread to the town." Clara looked toward the little cabin, then toward the valley hidden beneath snow. Only weeks earlier, no one had offered her a room. Now the whole town stood at her door. She could still remember every face that had looked away, every closed curtain, every careful excuse. She could also remember the warm broth, the fresh loaf, the piece of cheese quietly left on a porch. Cold Spur had not been made of only one kind of person. She looked back at the mayor. I'll help." Relief crossed every tired face. Then Clara calmly added, "But not the way your town expects." Samuel waited. No family pays more because they're hungry. No child leaves empty-handed. No widow stands outside wondering where she'll sleep. If I bake for Cold Spur, I bake for everyone. The old pastor slowly removed his gloves, his eyes lowered toward the snow. "We should have helped you." No one answered, because there was nothing left to argue. The truth had finally arrived on its own. For the next 2 weeks, Vance Farm never rested. Clara mixed dough before sunrise. Ruth gathered firewood. Neighbors from nearby ridges quietly arrived with eggs, milk, dried beans, and potatoes, without being asked, without keeping score. The old cabin became the busiest place on the mountain. Fresh bread cooled across wooden tables. Goat cheese filled the shelves. Hot soup waited beside the fire. One sled after another carried food down the hidden trail Ruth had shown Clara weeks before. The forgotten path crossed frozen creeks and sheltered pine valleys. While the main road remained buried beneath snow, that narrow mountain route stayed open. No one in Cold Spur remembered it. Clara's father had. His forgotten knowledge now carried life back into the valley. Soon, every family in town knew where their food came from. Not from the Holt farm, not from Margaret's storehouse, from the young widow living on the abandoned ridge. Margaret watched everything change. Her own flour bins emptied quickly. No one accepted unfair prices anymore. People simply waited for Clara's sleds. The ledger Margaret had carefully built became useless. Even Samuel, her own nephew, lowered his eyes whenever neighbors praised the woman who had saved the valley. One clear afternoon, weeks after the storm, Margaret climbed the mountain alone. She stopped outside the cabin. The same woman who had once ordered Clara to leave now stood quietly beside the gate. The wind lifted loose strands of gray hair across her face. "I came," she hesitated, "to thank you." Clara stood on the porch, holding a basket of warm bread. Neither woman spoke for several moments. Finally, Margaret looked around the farm. The repaired barn, the stacked firewood, the neat garden waiting beneath snow, smoke rising from the chimney. "You built all this?" Clara nodded once. "Yes." Margaret looked down at her worn boots. "I thought you'd fail." "I know. I was wrong." The words sounded strange coming from someone who had spent a lifetime believing she never needed to say them. Clara stepped forward. She handed Margaret a fresh loaf. The older woman looked surprised. "You still want me to take it?" Clara smiled gently. Hunger doesn't care about old arguments. Margaret accepted the bread with both hands. For the first time in years, she had no reply. She simply turned and began walking back toward the valley, much slower than she had climbed. Spring finally reached Black Ridge. Snow melted into running streams. Wildflowers pushed through dark earth. One quiet morning, Clara opened the small paper packet her mother had given her years before. She knelt inside the old stone garden, carefully planted every lavender seed, then covered them with rich mountain soil. Weeks later, soft purple blossoms covered the hillside. Travelers climbing toward Vance Farm could smell them long before they reached the cabin. People no longer called it Forgotten Land. They called it Vance Farm. The place where no hungry traveler was turned away. The place built by the widow everyone believed had lost everything. She had never inherited land. She had never received a deed. She had built her home with scarred hands, quiet work, and choices no one else could make for her. And every time the wind carried the scent of lavender across the mountain, it reminded the valley that the strongest homes are not always the ones passed down through a family. Sometimes, They are the ones built from nothing after every door has been closed. If this story stayed with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes it's never too late to begin again.